This presentation is going to be on the physics of wind power. We're going to cover a lot of the basics, and you're going to have a much clearer understanding of what makes a good turbine and a not so good turbine. Generally, there's three types of turbines: Savonius, Darius, and horizontal axis. The Savonius design on the top looks basically like a barrel that's cut in half. And there's all kinds of different versions of this design, but they all function about the same. It doesn't matter if it looks like a shell or if it looks like something else. It's a Savonius design, and it fits within that category as far as the way it works. Darius is also a vertical axis design, but has airfoil blades. The Darius turbines look all kinds of different ways as well, but again, they all function about the same in that sense. Horizontal axis, here's a small one and a large one. Again, we're going to set the axis horizontal, or set the generator in a horizontal fashion, and we're also going to have airfoil blades. If we're going to look at the physics of wind, we need to think about the physics of kinetic energy, because all wind is small particles, each having kinetic energy. If we're thinking about kinetic energy of an object, it's the 1/2 times the mass times the velocity squared. The mass of a ball is pretty easy to calculate. We could calculate that if we threw a ball, its mass, its velocity, we've got its kinetic energy. Wind is a little different. Lots and lots of small particles of nitrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide and other things, all moving. So we can't really calculate each individual molecule, so we're going to use a mass flow of particles. That mass flow is going to be equal to the density of the air times the swept area of the area we're calculating. In this case, the swept area of whatever turbine that we're going to use, and then the velocity of that air. And we're going to substitute that mass flow in, and we're going to come up with our equation of power is equal to 1/2 times the density times the swept area times the velocity cubed. Let's look at that a little closer. Again, velocity, the wind speed velocity, the swept area A, and the effective air density. Of greatest importance, if we were to look at this equation, is the velocity, because when we graph this equation for a small wind turbine, we can see that the power of the wind is exponential. It's cubically related to the wind speed. So as I increase that wind speed, I get a lot more power. So one of the things we see sometimes in advertisements is, this turbine is great. It will spin at low wind speeds. At those low wind speeds, there's very little power. And if there's very little power, we can convert very little power into very little electricity. And so the reality is, it doesn't matter that it spins at low wind speeds. An example of that is 2 times 2 times 2, if 2 is our wind speed, is 8, and 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000. I don't care about those low wind speeds because they don't have any power. And when I don't have any power, I can't convert that into any electrical power in my turbine. And so I need turbines that spin in moderate wind speeds where there's a lot more power. Every generation system is less than 100% efficient. We cannot capture all, convert one form of energy into a more useful form of energy without losses. And that's true for wind turbines. And so if I have the wind that's blowing, and I'm going to say that that wind has all the power it has, so we're starting with 100%. If we put that through a turbine, the absolute best that we can do is 59.3%. And if I can imagine those molecules moving towards that turbine, striking the blades of that turbine, causing the rotational energy, and then going beyond the turbine, and now they're at a slower speed because they've given up some of their energy. Well, the absolute maximum efficiency possible is 59.3%. That was calculated by Albert Betz, and it has not been proven wrong yet, and that's because it was a pretty good calculation. And he basically assumed that if they could give up as much energy as possible and be behind the turbine in straight air, it would be 59.3%. But the reality is that they're not. What happens is that turbine is that molecule of air is giving some of its energy to the turbine, and then the turbine, as it spins, is pushing that molecule, causing it to spin some. And that's wasted energy, that causing it to spin, or the wake rotation. With experiments, scientists have found that the faster that the blades spin, the less wake rotation losses occur. And so when I say the faster, I'm in particular talking about the tip of that blade. The faster the tip of that blade, the less wake rotation, and thus the less more efficiency. So let's make this more simple. The faster the tip, the more efficient the turbine. And that is going to hold true very well through a lot of the experiments that have been done in wind, and shows that the designs that have won out and are the most popular, this is true. So if I were to look at our three different types of turbines. Now again, these are just three pictures. Turbines are of all different shapes and sizes, but they generally fit into these three categories. In that Savonius turbine, I have almost a 100% drag machine, and in that drag machine I have slow tip speeds, because drag means that particle is striking that turbine, and really that turbine can only spin as fast as the air blows. The other two designs, because of their airfoil and the fact that they have lift and drag, they have much faster tip speeds, and thus they have much greater potential to have higher efficiency. And so already we're seeing that Savonius turbines are less efficient than the other two turbines, so they're already handicapped by that. Again, let's just relook at that. Savonius turbines have slow tip speed, Darius have moderate to fast tip speeds, and horizontal axis turbines have fast tip speeds. And again, horizontal axis could be any type of turbine of that design, small or large. Here's a picture of a large one. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about, what about that old Chicago-style windmill that we had back on the farm? Those have moderate to slow tip speeds due to high solidity and high drag. You can imagine that turbine being somewhat like a cross between a Savonius and a horizontal axis, where because I was lifting water and need lots of torque forces, they built it to have high solidity and thus have high drag. And so it works. They work very effectively in lifting water up. But if we were to try to have that same turbine generate electricity, its moderate to slow tip speed would just show that it probably has less efficiency than the other turbines. If I'm to graph all these things together, the red in this case is the power of the wind. That's the absolute maximum of what's available to me in the wind. That's that 100%. The Betz limit, 59%. That's all of the best I could ever do to capture is 59.3%. And finally, I've got the power curve of a little 1K turbine that shows that I have, that's the what it can do. So that's kind of what's reality. Every turbine is going to have somewhat of a reality. Their power curves are going to look a little different. This one has this drop off about 34 miles an hour, and what that is that's its protection measure against high wind speeds. And so different turbines' power curves are going to look different depending on how they deal with that overspeed protection. This one, it drops off. It doesn't drop off to zero, but it does drop off if the wind was to increase in a linear fashion. So if we're going to look at this basic equation again and get in a little more detail. In this case, if I look at rho, it is almost equal to 1. It's 1.2 at lowland sites, and it's about 1 at upland sites, and so I'm just going to ignore it because it's close enough to 1. It doesn't affect my equation all that much. A is the swept area, and I can calculate that using pi r squared, and however big my turbine is, it is, and the bigger the turbine, the more power. So if I was to see a turbine out there that's 3 feet across, I already know it's not a very big turbine. It's not going to generate very much electricity because it's not very big. Turbines that are big create a lot of power. Turbines that are small create a small amount of power. And so a turbine that is 3 foot across, for example, might run a couple of light bulbs. But to run a house, I might need a turbine that is anywhere from 10 to 16 to 25 feet in diameter to actually run a house. And then, of course, to run a bunch of houses, I need even bigger. And so don't think that small turbines are going to produce power. It doesn't matter which one of those three designs they are. Small turbines don't produce very much power. Wind speed. If I put a turbine in a place with low wind speed, no power. If I put a turbine in a place with a lot of wind speed, a lot of power. And so any turbine that's in an urban area is going to have not very much power because it's in an area with slow wind speed. Invariably, urban areas have low wind speeds. There's very few examples that that's not true, and so most cases you can imagine that. Part of that is because urban areas cause a lot of wind shear and cause a lot of slowdown of that wind around. So even if you have a windy city, the windy city, still inside the city limits of Chicago, or really inside any of the areas where there's a lot of houses and other things, there's so much wind shear that if I want a turbine, I have to get it way up above all of those things. And if that's feasible, great. If it's not, don't put anything low to the ground, especially in urban areas. Choosing that location. Avoid slow wind. Remember that power in the wind is cubically related to the wind speed. Avoid those slow winds. Avoid turbulent wind, and never put wind turbines on buildings. And that goes back to rules number 1 and 2. Avoid slow winds and avoid turbulent winds. In this case, I have my obstacle or my house and I need to avoid areas that are 20 times the height of the house, really in the downwind direction, but also a little bit in the upwind direction. Also 2 times the height of that house. So if I'm going to put that turbine, I have a 20-foot house, that turbine needs to be above 40-foot high, and probably even a little more than that above that house. So I need a 40-foot tower, maybe 50, and then I might have some 60-foot trees around that house. Well, now I'm 60-foot plus 120 foot. My turbine's going to have to be 120 foot in the air or greater. So I've got all those issues. So avoid slow winds, avoid turbulent winds if you want your turbine to produce power. If you don't want your turbine to produce power, go ahead and put it wherever you want. But again, this is where a good turbine that's going to produce some electricity needs to be placed in a correct location, also of the correct design that gives you the best opportunity to create electricity. Here's some examples. Here are 2 wind turbines that are on a building here in Lincoln, Nebraska. After 3 years, these turbines have effectively produced no power. I repeat, in 3 years of operation, they have never produced any power. And the reason is multiple-fold. Let's look at this. These are bad. They're inefficient design. So remember, this is that Savonius design. It's inherently inefficient, which already gives it that drawback. It's in a turbulent wind area. It's low to the ground. And this is an office building, and so they've actually had times where they have tied these turbines down because the vibrations caused by the fact that they did spin caused noise in the building. And so again, another reason not to put them on buildings is that annoying vibration that is difficult to remedy. Anybody that says they can, well, maybe, maybe not, but it's a risk that you face by putting that on. Multiple people have had that problem, not just one. Portland, Oregon. Again, here's a design where the design of the turbine is somewhat more reasonable. The height of the turbines look more reasonable, and yet this is not that good. Again, the turbine design is okay, but you have a turbulent wind. You can actually see that these 4 turbines are facing in 4 different directions, and that's because the wind is so turbulent up at that site that it really hampers their ability to perform. I don't have the data for these, but I'm convinced that they're not probably doing very well by my observation of them. Here's some turbines I took a picture of at a school in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and there's 3 turbines in this picture, so let's just touch on them a little bit. So this is a turbine that's right on top of the building there. It's shrouded. I don't particularly like shrouded turbines because shrouded turbines cause for small wind turbines because that shroud takes a lot more material. So we may say that oh, we're going to be able to catch more of that wind because we're going to funnel it into my turbine or some other thing that shrouds say. But what happens is when you build it and you put all that material in, you end up with a smaller turbine because of all that shrouds. Plus, this is very low to the ground, so there's very turbulent winds low to the ground. There's slower winds low to the ground. And again, we put it on a building. Now I've got to deal with that vibration. Let's look at this one. This is a little better design in the fact that it is airfoil bladed and is a horizontal axis turbine. So design's okay. It's clear up in the winds up high. You know, I'd love to see that tower be another 20 feet higher, but again, it's probably going to produce some electricity and maybe do reasonably well for what it is. So that's better. Here's a third one hiding over here behind the turbine. Again, I'm going to call this bad. The design is a Darius type, which is okay, except for a lot of Darius turbines tend to be designed for short towers, low to the ground. And because of it's low to the ground, you're in turbulent wind, you're in slow wind, and it doesn't matter that your design's okay when you place that turbine in a place with poor wind. And that's one challenge with that particular turbine, is it tends to put them in low wind speeds, low to the ground. Here's one I took a picture of. Again, this is a good design. The turbine itself is a good design, but also its siting. It's clear. It's in clear winds. It's up high. It's on a tall tower. It's going to produce quite a bit of power. Here's actually one that I installed, and you can see I didn't put it on the tallest tower, but I also put it in a very, very clear area. So we're on top of the hill. There's no trees around, and so again, we put this small wind turbine up, and we're producing quite a lot of power from that turbine. Here's a pretty good one. Again, same kind of a thing. This is a very old design turbine, 60 to 70-year-old turbine potentially, but with some maintenance, they've been able to keep this going, and it's a pretty good design, clear winds, up high, tall tower. So let's review. The power in the wind in watts is equal to 1/2 times the density of the air times the swept area times the velocity cubed. Remember, put these in all SI units to get the proper results. We need high wind speeds. That velocity cubed is very, very important. If it's not in an area with good wind speeds, don't expect much production. So open areas are best. Up high, never put a turbine on a building. Big turbines. Again, we drive down the road, we see a little turbine, it's not going to produce much power. Now, what's the goal of that turbine? Sometimes there is a use for small turbines in battery charging or remote operations where we're just trickle charging a battery. That small turbine may be fine if it has access to wind, right? So I'm not saying that small turbines don't have their place, but realize that a small turbine is not going to generate very much electricity, and if I'm expecting it to generate quite a bit to help me provide for a house or something like that, small turbines just aren't going to get it done. So big turbines can produce a lot more power. Conversely, small turbines produce only a very small amount of power. If you have more questions, please feel free to visit. I have a bunch of different places you can go. bioenergy.unl.edu is my website. I have a YouTube channel called CropWatch Bioenergy, and then the Farm Energy Community of Practice at eExtension, which is at www.extension.org. This presentation has been put together by Nebraska Extension.